What piece of work is a man? How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties. History doesn't record whether any of the 1,400 Marine officers and convicts aboard the First Fleet were inspired to recall this quote from Hamlet upon disembarking at Sydney Cove on the 26th of January 1788 and catching sight of the nomadic natives who had called the surrounding bush home for millennia. It's unlikely though. As Robert Hughes's research revealed 2 centuries later, the natives were, at the time, quote, coated with a mixture of rancid fish oil, animal grease, ochre, beach sand, dust and sweat, filthy and funky in the extreme. This is exactly the sort of traditional costume your typical racist mistook for primitive back in the 18th century. Even more racistly, every one of the 1,400 who disembarked that day probably fantasised, as they scrabbled to build a camp from scratch, knowing they faced nothing but hunger and privation in this alien and hostile land for the foreseeable future, about one day having even the most basic of privileged European luxuries, like warm clothes and a roof. Some might have dared imagine the camp flourishing, to the point where a troupe of amateur thespians could perform some semblance of a Shakespeare play, as if that would alleviate the challenges of life on the wrong side of the planet. How naive they all were. As we now know, the heights of sophistication were already all around them, if only they had the eyes to see. Thank God we live in more enlightened times, where Shakespeare has finally been consigned to history and the nobility of the original savages is returned to its rightful reverence. From Shakespeare to Shakespeare, as the old bard might himself have said if he was half as clever a wordsmith as the boring old, need I say white, boffins say he was. Modern Australia has been blessed with not one but 2 examples of this ancient erudition lately. On the weekend, a couple of people associated with the traditional Indigenous Mardi Gras were photographed performing a drama that required no words nor even action to tell a story as timeless as the Mardi Gras itself. Take that, Jesus, you racist coloniser. And consider yourself lucky. Had the original inhabitants reduced themselves to inventing tools, they too would have carved a crucifix for you to carry up Oxford Street when you arrived on that fateful day with all the other genocidal invaders. Descendants of those invaders have accused these 2 performers of being disrespectful and challenged them to make similarly offensive statements about other religions. But why should they? It was Christians who built everything in this country and are therefore the only ones to blame. This spear-based performance would not have been possible, however, had not traditional AFL player Adam Goodes normalised it when he, in a moment of cultural clarity, abandoned his position as a goal-kicking midfielder to revive the long-forgotten part of the sport known as spear shaking. Forget the ephemeral context of this statue, white settlers exploiting Goodes with their money, fame and Australian of the Year awards, and marvel at the symbolism of this skilled warrior emerging from a garden bed to ward off the evil spirits descending on the headquarters of his Swanee tribe. While some men are born great and others achieve greatness, Goodsy thrusts greatness on everyone. What a time to be alive. No wonder China can only muster the courage to let off a couple of rounds from a ship hundreds of kilometres off the coast before scurrying back to Beijing. Our cultural resolve and technological defence force is more than a match for even a superpower like China.